Melissa. I'm a researcher in San Diego, here to talk about the popsicle stick method, which is a method to restore seagrass using direct bare root transplants. So we're out here in San Diego Harbor, where seagrass has been restored successfully using this method for years. It's also been used just to the north in Mission Bay, and further than that in Newport Back Bay and across the California coast. In Newport Back Bay, they've used this popsicle stick method as a part of a seagrass restoration project for living shorelines, in which seagrass and oysters have been restored alongside one another. In Southern California, you can find a lot more tropical species in seagrass than you might find in the rest of California. So in addition to the usual critters like spiny lobster or halibut, you can also find things like green sea turtles or even giant Pacific seahorses. So assuming you've selected an appropriate site for restoration, which is discussed in our first video, you can then move on to selecting your anchor type. So within the popsicle stick method, there are a lot of different anchor types you could use. People have used things like wooden popsicle sticks or tongue depressors, paper popsicle sticks, essentially anything that can be used as an anchoring device to be inserted into the sediment. And then you'll also need a way to carry the bundled shoots once they're attached to the anchors. So for example, the Orange County coastkeepers in Newport Back Bay have successfully used slates with slits cut in to the sides such that the bundles can be loaded into the slates and then handed over to divers for an easy deployment. You also will need any equipment you want for monitoring, so quadrats, transect tapes, and something to measure shoot height. To begin your restoration project, first you're going to have to harvest shoots. So once you're ready to harvest, a team of scuba divers or waders, if you're able to do intertidal sampling, can walk or swim to a donor meadow. Care should be taken when you're harvesting from a donor meadow because you don't want to have an intense impact. So it's recommended to never harvest more than 10% of a donor meadow, and also not to take all the shoots from one place. Once you've collected your shoots from the donor meadow, you can place them into a bag. It's not a bad idea to leave some sediment around the roots and rhizomes to reduce transplant shock when planting. However, if you are transplanting your shoots far away, there could be concern with transplantation of invasive species associated with the excess sediment, so you may want to rinse your shoots before deploying into an area that's particularly far away from your donor meadow or into a new area where there's concern for invasive species transplant. Once you've collected all of your shoots, before you transplant, it's best to store the shoots in cold running seawater if possible to reduce mortality of shoots before you get to your restoration site. Once you've collected all of your shoots from your donor meadow, you can return shoreside and prepare your bundles. So this is done by taking about 8 to 15 shoots per bundle with a piece of twine about 4 to 6 inches, tying one end of the twine to the middle of the popsicle stick and the other end of the twine just above the root and the rhizome of the seagrass. You've put your bundles together, you can load those bundles into the slate that you've prepared ahead of time, making sure that your bundles don't get tangled and stay organized for a quick and easy deployment by divers once they're in the water. After you've prepared all of your bundles and put them into the slate can then be placed upside down on top of a bucket of seawater in order to keep the shoots in the water while being transplanted to the restoration site. Once you've prepared all of your bundles, you're ready to transplant. So when you get to your restoration site, someone can pass the slate of pre-prepared bundles over to the diver, ready for deployment. Divers can swim along their predetermined restoration area or transect and plant the bundles roughly 1 meter apart. It's typical to plant about 1 meter apart, although different spacings have been used by different practitioners. To transplant the bundle in the popsicle stick, stick the one tip of the popsicle stick into the sediment about 4 to 6 inches until the root and rhizome are just at the surface of the sediment. If you're able to, it's easier to turn the popsicle stick parallel to the surface of the sediment once you've reached the bottom to ensure a more secure anchor. Then all you have to do is monitor the success of your project. So it's recommended upon deployment that you measure both the spacing of the shoots and also the area that you've transplanted so you can compare success to future monitoring periods. Now that we've gone through the mechanics of the method itself, we can talk a little bit about the pros and cons. So all in all, the popsicle stick method is a pretty cheap and fast method of restoration. So the materials required are not particularly expensive, and also the restoration itself can happen fairly quickly. The other thing is that it can involve community members pretty effectively, particularly for intertidal restoration, where public can actually be involved in the transplantation of the shoots. But even if you're doing subtidal restoration that requires divers, community members can still be involved in the bundling of the shoots to be handed over to divers for transplantation. The other thing is that the materials can all be very biodegradable, which makes the method fairly sustainable. You don't have debris left over if you make an intentional effort to use things like biodegradable twine rather than plastic string, and the popsicle sticks will degrade over time as well. The downside of using a popsicle stick transplant method might be low genetic diversity, particularly if you're harvesting from a single donor meadow or all in one small location, but that can be mitigated by harvesting from multiple donor meadows or using seeding methods in the same restoration site in order to increase the genetic diversity. So all in all, the method is a pretty promising method. It's been used effectively across the region and is probably a pretty good candidate for your restoration site.